The knock came sharp and urgent, breaking the stillness of the night. The woman froze, her hand hovering above the mortar where crushed herbs awaited her touch. The air carried unease, as though the grove itself had whispered this warning. The voice outside, low and insistent, called her name. Reluctantly, she moved to the door. Her heart beat loud in her ears. Stepping out into the moonlight, she was met by the chief's son, his face a mask of desperation. Whispers followed her from the shadows beyond the huts, their words like nettles, brushing against her back. Fear and suspicion lingered in the air. She knew what they thought of her. They always had. But their voices fell silent as she met the man's gaze, steady and sharp. "They're dying," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. He leaned closer, his breath unsteady. "The elders say it's a curse. Only you, only your kind of knowledge, can stop it." She said nothing, turning to gather her tools. The words stung, but the urgency in his tone left no room for pride. From the corner of her eye, she saw the eldest of the villagers watching her, their expressions a mixture of scorn and fear. She stepped out of her hut with purpose, her pouch of remedies at her side, but then the whispers came, not from the villagers, but from the forbidden grove. The sound sent a chill through her bones, low and rhythmic, like the murmur of unseen voices. She paused, her gaze drawn toward the line of trees that loomed at the edge of the village. The whispers grew louder, as though the grove itself was alive, calling her closer. The man noticed her hesitation and tugged at her arm. "Forget the grove," he muttered. "They say it swallows anyone foolish enough to go near." Ignoring him, she moved toward the trees, the whispers pulling her like a tide. As she reached the edge, the ground beneath her glowed faintly. Tracks, too large for any human, pulsed with dim light, leading deeper into the forest. Her breath quickened, and for a moment she hesitated. The stories she'd heard since childhood rang in her mind. Tales of Nyoka's wrath and the grove's jealous spirits. Still, she followed the tracks, her steps cautious. The path was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves. She stopped abruptly when her eyes fell upon a mask lying half buried in the soil. It was carved with symbols she recognized, but couldn't fully understand, their edges etched with an unsettling precision. Her fingers brushed the wood, and a faint hum reverberated through her. The trees around her bore the same markings, glowing faintly under the moonlight. They pulsed like a heartbeat, as if they were alive. Her breath caught, her mind raced, questioning the origin of these carvings, their purpose, and why they called to her in this way. Then she felt it, a presence, heavy and cold, watching from beyond the shadows. Her pulse quickened as she turned sharply, searching for movement, for proof of what she felt. But the grove remained still, cloaked in eerie quiet. The whispers that had called her earlier now seemed to mock her, growing softer, retreating. Sudden snap of a branch broke the silence, the sound piercing the heavy air. Her body froze, every instinct screaming at her to run. Yet she stood rooted, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Whatever was watching her, it wasn't hiding anymore. The presence loomed closer, unseen but undeniable. The grove's warning was clear, but whether it meant to drive her away or pull her deeper, she could not yet tell. Wary glances followed her as she stepped into the open. Murmurs rippled like dry leaves through the crowd. "She shouldn't be here," someone whispered. "She's the reason this is happening." Another voice, louder and bolder, answered. "And yet you still call her for help. What choice do we have?" The chief's son stood apart, watching the tension build. His face was pale, his breaths shallow. He clutched his side as though holding something back. When she reached him, he gestured toward the grove. "This illness, it's spreading. If it reaches the elders, there will be chaos." Her eyes flicked toward the elders. Their grim expressions gave away nothing, but their silence felt heavy with judgment. One elder spoke at last. "You of all people should know better than to meddle where you do not belong." The words were sharp, meant to cut. She said nothing, her gaze falling instead on the faint glow of the grove behind them. A memory stirred, unbidden. The proverbs her grandmother once whispered warned of Nyoka's wrath. The serpent spirit guarded the sacred grounds, striking down those who disturbed its balance. But the proverbs had not stopped her sister, nor had they brought her back. She glanced at the bracelet on her wrist, faded but still whole. It was the last piece of her sister. She had lived. "It isn't natural," the chief's son said, breaking her thoughts. "This illness, it's tied to the grove, isn't it?" He hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. "I have seen things, shadows moving where there should be none. It's as if the forest itself is alive." Her childhood friend pulled her aside. "You shouldn't go," she warned, her voice low. This is beyond you, beyond anyone." Her hand tightened around her arm, a plea in her eyes. "There are things in that grove better left undisturbed. You know this." She nodded, but her gaze was drawn once more to the grove's edge. Her mind wandered to the fragments of a ritual her grandmother once showed her. A chant, half remembered. Symbols scratched into the dirt with trembling hands. It was meant to call for guidance, but only if the spirits deemed you worthy. The villagers' murmurs grew louder. "She's cursed. She'll bring more harm than good. Maybe the serpent spirit follows her." Their accusations came faster, sharper, fueled by fear. She held her head high, but their words stung. The chief's son pulled up his sleeve, revealing a faint, serpent-shaped mark winding up his arm. "It started after I went too close," he said quietly. "I thought it was nothing. Now I'm not so sure." Her fingers brushed the mark and something ancient stirred in her chest. "If you'll help me," he said, his voice wavering, "you'll do it quietly. No one can know." She nodded. The villagers grew restless, their voices dividing like the branches of a tree. "Leave the grove alone," some cried. "It protects us. Destroy it," others shouted. "It's brought nothing but suffering." Her focus turned to the stories she had read, hidden deep within her family's old books. Promises made and broken generations ago. Nyoka's wrath was not unprovoked. The grove loomed darker as the sun set. She could feel its weight pressing against her. Whispers crept from the shadows, their source unseen. The truth lay ahead, tangled in secrecy. And the grove, silent and watchful, waited for her to act. She flipped through the brittle pages, her fingers brushing against faded ink. The words spoke of Nyoka's curse, of broken promises, and the vengeance of the serpent spirit. The descriptions felt alive, the details sharp, as though written by someone who had seen the destruction firsthand. It wasn't just a story, it was a warning. The symbols carved into the manuscript mirrored the ones etched into her memory. She had seen them before, in the stories her grandmother whispered, and the forbidden places her feet had dared to tread. Her eyes followed the page's final line, a chilling phrase etched deep into her mind. "The balance once broken devours those who shatter it." Her steps faltered as the path grew narrower. The air felt charged, heavy with unseen energy. Symbols etched into the bark of trees glowed faintly, their shapes twisting in patterns she recognized from her family's teachings. Each step forward deepened her unease, yet she couldn't turn back. A low, mournful cry pierced the air. It was followed by another, echoing from a different direction, then another. The cries seemed to circle her, their tone unnatural, like warnings carried on the wind. As she pressed on, faint glowing, footprints appeared in the dirt, leading her deeper into the grove. Her breath quickened. She stopped abruptly, her eyes catching movement in the corner of her vision. A flicker, a shadow, no, a figure. Her heart clenched as she recognized it, her sister. She reached out instinctively, her voice faltering on, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years, but the figure vanished, leaving her in silence. The air grew denser, suffocating, as though the grove itself watched her every move. She could feel it, not just a presence but a force, ancient and unyielding. Her legs threatened to buckle under the weight of its gaze. He stood just outside the grove's edge, hesitant but resolute. "If we're doing this, no one can know," he said firmly. His words carried more than caution. They carried ambition, a glint of greed she could sense even as he masked it with concern. The elder approached her quietly, his tone measured but laced with urgency. "You tread on dangerous ground. This is not a path you can walk alone." His offer of guidance felt genuine, but his eyes betrayed something else, doubt, perhaps even fear. Unbeknownst to her, the elder whispered words of warning to the villagers. He called her reckless, a danger to them all. As she moved deeper into the grove, his influence began to spread, casting shadows of doubt among those who had once trusted her. He scoffed at her concerns, dismissing the glowing symbols and eerie cries as mere superstition. "You give the grove too much power," he said sharply. "It's just a place, nothing more." She stepped closer, her voice low and unyielding. "You saw the mark on your arm. You felt its presence. Don't lie to yourself." They stood at an impasse, each unwilling to fully trust the other, yet knowing they needed to move forward together. The tension between them was palpable, a silent agreement born of necessity rather than choice. She knelt before the carvings, the symbols glowing faintly under her touch. Her hands trembled as she prepared the ritual, the chant barely forming on her lips. The grove seemed to breathe around her, watching, waiting. She knew the risk. One misstep could mean her life. Visions clawed at her mind as the ritual deepened. She saw her ancestors, their faces blurred by time, but their actions unmistakable, promises made in desperation, betrayals buried beneath the weight of shame. The curse wasn't just the village's, it was her family's burden to bear. She turned to him sharply. "This isn't the grove's doing," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "It's us. It's what we've taken from it, what we've done to it." He said nothing, his silence confirming what she already suspected. The elder's interference was swift and calculated, his fear of Nyoka's wrath driving him to act against her. His words painted her as the enemy, turning those around him into obstacles she hadn't anticipated. She faced a choice: expose his betrayal or keep the village from fracturing further. As the ritual ended, the earth beneath her trembled. The grove fell silent, the oppressive weight of the air growing heavier. A shadow stretched before her, shifting and coiling like a serpent. It loomed closer, a silent warning that the spirit was awake and watching. The vines hung heavy over the altar, their tangled roots like fingers clinging to forgotten secrets. The air felt oppressive, each breath dragging as if the grove itself resisted her presence. Her hand brushed against a scarred symbol carved deep into the stone. It was defiled, its edges chipped and blackened. The altar was no longer a place of reverence but a wound in the heart of the grove. Scattered remnants surrounded her, broken pots, decayed fabrics, and faded markings smeared into the dirt. The scene spoke of a ritual abandoned in chaos. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of knowledge. The sickness, the glowing markings, the cries in the night, it all began here. "You knew," she said, her voice sharp. "You knew." The grove was disturbed. The elder's silence was his answer, but when she pressed, his calm shattered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he snapped. "The grove's power was meant to save us, to make the land prosperous again. But the spirit, it was angered." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. "You desecrated this place. You brought the curse." He tried to defend himself, his voice growing desperate. "It was for the village, for our survival." But there was no mistaking the guilt in his eyes. As he spoke, her gaze drifted to the faint markings on the altar, her fingers tracing their familiar shapes. They were more than symbols. They were warnings. This wasn't just about the elder's greed. It was personal. The pieces fell into place with a weight that left her breathless. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was iron. "You sacrificed her, didn't you? My sister. You thought her life would appease Nyoka." The elder recoiled as if struck. "We had no choice," he whispered. "The village was dying. We didn't know it would anger the spirit further." The truth hit, like a storm, uprooting everything she had believed about her sister's disappearance. The betrayal burned deep, but the ground beneath her feet shifted before she could react. The earth trembled, cracks snaking outward from the altar. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar as the grove stirred. From the shadows, a form emerged, vast and serpentine, its scales glinting with an unnatural glow. Nyoka had awakened, its fury palpable in the charged air. Its presence was overwhelming, its gaze burning into her as if peering into her very soul. She could feel its rage, its sorrow, its need for balance. The grove demanded action, and it demanded it now. Her hands shook as she turned to the altar. She knew the choice before her: destroy it and risk Nyoka's wrath, or restore it with a ritual that could claim her life. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but there was no time to hesitate. Behind her, the chief's son stumbled, his body racked with pain. The mark on his arm pulsed, glowing like molten fire. He gasped, barely able to stand. The curse was consuming him. The spirit loomed closer, its form twisting as it tested her resolve. Whispers filled her mind, voices that dredged up her deepest fears and guilt. Her sister's face flashed before her, her eyes accusing. She forced herself to move, her steps deliberate. The symbols on the altar blurred as tears filled her eyes, but her hands remained steady. The chant came slowly at first, then stronger as she poured her will into the ritual. Each word felt like a battle, the air thick with resistance. The grove responded, its energy surging. The ground shook violently, and the serpent's form writhed, its presence both terrifying and majestic. She felt her strength waning, but she pressed on, her voice unyielding. The final word left her lips, and silence fell. The tremors ceased, the air still. She collapsed to her knees, her breath shallow. The grove's energy shifted, its hostility replaced with a fragile calm. She looked to the chief's son. His breathing steadied, the mark on his arm fading. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. She could feel the loss within herself. The connection to her ancestors, to the visions that had guided her, was gone. The villagers gathered, their faces a mix of awe and unease. Some called her a hero, but others whispered that she had angered the spirit further. The elder stepped forward, his head bowed. "I was wrong," he said, his voice heavy with shame. "You saved us even when we didn't deserve it." She said nothing, her focus on the grove's edge. The truth of her sister's fate weighed heavily, but there was a strange peace in knowing. The chief's son approached her, his arrogance replaced by humility. "I'll honor the grove," he promised, "and I'll honor your sacrifice." She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the shadows. She could feel the grove watching, its presence a reminder that balance was both delicate and sacred. As the villagers began to rebuild, she stepped forward, not as an outcast but as a protector. The grove's silent whispers followed her, a promise and a warning that its guardian would always remain. The air felt lighter now, but the weight in her chest remained. The grove stood quiet behind her, its energy no longer hostile, but its silence carried a message. She ran her hand over the scarred symbols on the altar, her thoughts heavy. Greed and arrogance had fractured something sacred, and the consequences would echo long after the curse was lifted. She closed her eyes, recalling the proverbs whispered by her grandmother. The ancestors had always warned of balance, a harmony that must be protected. Yet time and desperation had led the village astray. She now understood the fragile bond between the grove and the village. It wasn't just a place, it was a living reminder of what could be lost when power and progress was sought without respect for the past. Her gaze fell to the altar, and her sister's face flashed in her mind. Secrets had festered, and those lies had torn her family apart. But in the truth, however painful, there was also healing. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but it had opened a path to understanding. She exhaled slowly, letting go of some of the bitterness that had bound her for years. The voices of children drifted toward her, their laughter breaking through her thoughts. She turned, watching as they ran through the village, oblivious to the burden their elders carried. The future rested in their hands, and she would ensure they understood the lessons learned here. She gathered the children around her, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you know why the grove whispers?" she asked. They shook their heads, eager to hear more. She spoke of the grove's history, the sacred balance it guarded, and the mistakes that had brought it to the brink of destruction. Her words wove lessons into stories, tales of spirits who watched over the land, and the dangers of forgetting the promises made to them. The children listened closely, their expressions shifting between awe and unease. She told them of Nyoka, not as a spirit to fear, but as a guardian of the land's harmony. Through proverbs and vivid imagery, she planted seeds of respect for nature and the ancestors' wisdom. She vowed silently that this generation would not repeat the sins of the past. As she spoke, the grove stood silent, its shadows shifting faintly. Whispers returned, faint and distant, as though the grove acknowledged her efforts. When the children left, she lingered at the edge of the trees, her thoughts drifting back to her sister. The grove's energy shifted, subtle yet unmistakable. Shadows rippled like water, moving with a deliberate grace. It was as if the spirit itself had stirred, a quiet reminder of its presence. She felt no fear, only reverence. The grove had spoken through silence, its warning clear. Balance was sacred, and it must never be taken for granted again. She turned away, leaving the grove behind her, but she could still feel its watchful eye. As she walked, the village began to stir with new purpose. The whispers of doubt and blame faded, replaced by a cautious respect for what had been restored. She stepped forward, not just as a healer, but as a keeper of wisdom, a protector of the fragile balance between her people and the spirits of the grove.